In which case, can we approve the minutes of the last Cabinet meeting on pages 1 to 6? Are they agreed?
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you. And as usual, to confirm that items of business marked Part 1 will be considered in public, and they are reports 5 to 12, and items in Part 2, which are reports 13 to 16, will be held in private. The first report tonight, agenda item 5, page 7, Social Services, Housing and Public Health Policy Overview Committee, review into hospital discharges. Councillor Cawthorne.
Thank you, Leader. I move the report and recommendations. I invite the POC Chairman to address Cabinet. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. I am pleased to present this report to Cabinet, which details the Social Services, Housing and Public Health Policy Overview Committee's review of hospital discharges in Hillingdon. With the number of people aged 65 and over increasing across the country, there has also been an increase in the number of older people being admitted to hospital. Any delay in discharging patients who are medically fit from hospital increases pressure on limited hospital resources and impacts on patients. It is therefore important that all of the organisations involved work together to ensure that the discharge process is as efficient and effective as possible. Joined-up care remains the single most important feature for ensuring greater patient safety and efficient hospital discharge planning. During our investigations, we found that a significant amount of work has already been undertaken by the Council and its partners to improve discharging medically fit patients as soon as possible, and work has also been undertaken to prevent hospital admission in the first place. There are, however, still a number of challenges that need to be tackled, such as consistency in the speed of starting the discharge process and adequate provision of care home places to meet future demands. The key to many of these challenges is improved communication with patients within organisations and between partners. We kindly request Cabinet to endorse the recommendations set out in this report, and in doing so, it is hoped that the discharge process will bring about improvements for patients in terms of their care and for the health system by reducing the costs associated with longer hospital delays. Finally, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank all of the witnesses and officers that contributed to this review. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cawthorne.
Thank you, Leader. As Councillor Bridges said, this is an issue which is of great significance to the health and social care economy in Hillingdon and to the services our residents receive. And as he also says, a significant amount of time and effort has gone into this across the partnership in recent years. I am actually quite encouraged by what we've seen in the last year, particularly through discharge to assess, and there's been some great work that's gone on between partners to make that happen. But as he rightly says, there's much more to do still. I do think, therefore, this is a timely report, and it makes a welcome contribution to this whole process. Some of the recommendations are already moving forward as I speak, and I think really for me the point of POC reviews is often less about new policy recommendations, but really to explore, test and validate existing policy approaches, and where possible to strengthen those. And I think that's very much what's happened here, and I very much welcome what you've done. I welcome their considered approach, and I would invite you, Councillor Bridges, to take back our thanks to your colleagues, and in the meantime I commend the report and recommendations to Cabinet. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. As someone who's had a family member discharged twice in the last 3 months, I've now got a much better understanding of where some of the issues arise. And it really is one about communication. I like recommendation 1 about getting the information straight away. I don't think there's any doubt that whilst the hospitals are making a lot of efforts to try and improve, there is still a step change for them to go through in terms of actually making it very clear what the process is and who the contact is that's going to be responsible for ensuring that that is a complete end-to-end process. And the experience we've had twice has been one where, on both occasions, different parts of the medical teams have not themselves come together to be able to bring to the point where discharge is smooth. there's been delays, and therefore you've got people, both family waiting to collect, and the patient waiting, hanging around, not clear whether they're actually going out that day or the next day, and that can cause a certain amount of stress when it starts getting dark and they think they're going to be there for an extra 24 hours. So my view is that this is very much about process. This isn't medical. This is about end-to-end processing, and the hospital need to get much better at doing that, and I'm confident Councillor Cawthorne, in his capacity as the Health and Welfare Chairman, will reinforce that point at every opportunity with the health professionals.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right, Councillor Mills. Adult social care in particular have worked very well on this over the years, and they're working with the hospital to try to resolve that sort of issue that you've raised. Much of any problem that arises with delayed discharges, particularly for the elderly, does lay with the NHS, and it is them that have got to get their act together. Having said that, they're well aware of this, and they are working to improve, and hopefully that we will see some results. Could I endorse those thanks to your committee, Councillor Bridges, and thank you very much. Are these recommendations adopted? Agreed. Thank you. Moving on then, agenda item 6, page 39, review by the Children, Young People and Learning Policy Overview Committee, supporting children with special education needs and disabilities, SEND, in their early years. Councillor Simmons.
Thank you, Leader. I'll simply begin by moving the report that's on page 39 and invite the chairman of that policy committee to come along and to introduce it.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm pleased to present this report detailing the identification and transition processes in place for children with special educational needs and disabilities in their early years. The purpose of this review was to consider how children with SEND had their needs identified and to understand and explore the current interventions in place to address these needs. This was notwithstanding the significant work already undertaken by the London Borough of Hillingdon and other partners to engage with parents and children with SEND. The committee heard evidence from the Cabinet Member for Education and Children's Services and a wide range of witnesses that worked with children. The witness sessions were valuable and provided an insight into the activities and processes already in place. It was great to see the committee engage with witnesses as a whole, and I know that all members valued their evidence, feedback and constructive criticism. The findings by the committee acknowledge and recognise the work undertaken by the Council to support its residents. In concluding the review, the committee made some practical and supportive recommendations that fit neatly into the work being undertaken. These are focused around enhancing communication channels and monitoring outcomes. Finally, I would like to put on record my thanks to the witnesses that supported the review, along with council officers. Their contribution was invaluable. Subject to this review being approved by Cabinet, a copy of the major review report will be sent to all witnesses who took part in the review. Thank you, Leader.
Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Councillor Palmer, and please do take back our thanks to you, to your colleagues and the officers that supported you in producing the report. I think it's a very important piece of context that we know all the research shows that the investment in the early years is the most significant determinant of how children do later on in life. It makes a bigger difference then than it does at primary school or at secondary school or at A-level stage in terms of the educational outcomes that it produces. And for children with special educational needs and disabilities who, as we saw highlighted in the recent Ofsted inspection, by and large get quite a good service in Hillingdon and are part of a good system, we need to continue to make sure they're not overlooked. I think it's particularly valuable that you've provided some positive feedback about a number of different aspects of the service. It's useful that it highlights ways in which things could be improved, and the points about communication that were raised by Councillor Mills in a different context earlier on seem to apply equally well here, because we know this is a very complex environment. If you are a parent in this situation of finding out your child has a special education need or a disability, knowing where to go in a system where there are lots of really good voluntary providers, charitable providers, statutory providers, different schools and nurseries, all of whom potentially can help. It's a big challenge, and I think there's some really helpful steers that come out in that particular direction. And I suspect this is probably the beginning of a longer conversation, because you've highlighted in here a number of the statutory duties which the Council has, and we need to continue to make sure that in fulfilling those, that we see continued improvement in the services that are available to our youngest residents, and of course their mums and dads who want to make sure that they do get a good start in life. So thank you very much indeed. I look forward to the committee and indeed to the Council returning to this particular area of work.
Could I add my thanks to your committee as well, Councillor Palmer, and are those recommendations agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 7, page 67, the Council budget 17-18 month 9 revenue and capital budget monitoring. Councillor Bianco.
Thank you, Leader. As you say, this is month 9, which is December, and this shows yet again a small improvement in the general fund budget outcome, an underspend increasing now over 1.1 million, and that is good news all round. Of course, the figures that run behind that, of course, are that savings are being banked at an increasing rate to ensure that we get to the end of the year with the savings target fully delivered. That capital is underspending again, but is undoubtedly a lot of that is will be rolled over and spent later. And most importantly, that our general fund balances are now looking as though they're going to be 39 or more million by the end of the year, which is a very encouraging place to be. It's, of course, a good news story. It's not the only good news story we're going to hear about finance tonight, but it is one that sets us up nicely for the later part. There are 4 recommendations at the bottom of page 67 and on the top of page 68, which I will move at this time, and no doubt you will add some words to this.
Thank you, Councillor Bianco. The recommendations are to note the forecast budget position at the end of month 9, to note the Treasury Management update at December 17. That's Appendix C, page 107, where, as usual, we will see that our 114 million invested is bringing in 0.42%, and the outstanding debts, general fund outstanding debts of 62.3 million are costing us 3.38%. There's one scheduled general fund Public Works Loan Board debt repayment and equal instalment of principal repayment of 0.75 million this month. Gilt yields ended the month slightly lower than it started. However, premiums remain too high to make early repayments of debt feasible. Importantly, there were no breaches of prudential indicators or non-compliance with Treasury Management policy and practices. Recommendation 3 covers a delegated authority to myself and the Chief Executive, covering appointments of consultants and agency workers where that assignment's exceeded 50k in cost. Appendix F, pages 108 to 110, show that detail between the 25th of January and 15th of February. And the final recommendation, recommendation 4, which will be of interest to a couple of the councillors in the room at very least, to agree in principle a grant of 284,000 to provide funding for the rebuilding of the Guide Hut in Vernon Drive, which is in Harefield, to be funded from the 17-18 Approved Youth Provision Capital Programme. They are the 4 formal recommendations. We are all seeing on TV, in the newspapers and social media at this time, stories of local authorities facing financial meltdown and financial difficulties, and that indeed is true. However, here we have a very solid position at month 9, as is the norm in Hillingdon under this administration, a very solid position to carry forward into next year. Are the recommendations agreed? Thank you. We now move on to Agenda B, This is agenda item 8, the Council's budget and medium-term financial forecast covering the years 2018-19 to 2022-23. Councillor Bianco.
Thank you, Leader. Well, this was the other bit of financial matter that I was referring to just a moment or two ago. As you rightly say, it's the Council's proposed budget for the forthcoming financial year. There are 120 pages of jolly exciting and detailed stuff, setting out in great length and detail what we are proposing to do in the forthcoming year. Now, it so happens that a week tonight there will be another opportunity at the full council meeting to debate this at some length, and I shall be. So I will keep my remarks fairly short tonight. The recommendations are as shown on page 2 of the report, 7 recommendations. But I think it's worth reminding anybody that hasn't heard the news already that for the 10th year running, for those under the age of 65, there will be no increase in council tax. I'll repeat that for the benefit of our viewers on YouTube: no increase in council tax. And for those over 65, it's the 12th year that there will be no increase in council tax. And it's important to understand that that is not an increase in council tax nor a levy of social care precept. And that's only been running for 3 years, but we haven't levied it in any of those 3 years either, and we aren't going to this year coming. That is extremely good news for everybody in the borough. It means significant savings for everybody over what they would have been paying if we'd have been raising council tax in each of those 10 years gone by. And I will speak about that at more length next week when I have a wider audience who I'm sure will be thrilled to hear all the things that I'm going to say about what we're going to be doing in the forthcoming year. But it's a good news story, undoubtedly. It's one that we should and could be and will be and are proud of. And I am sure that much more will be said of this as time goes forward. But anyway, for the moment, I will move those recommendations and leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor Bianco. I think the other point to mention, and there will be a time, as you say, next week to cover this in detail, fees and charges in the main remain frozen again, and we maintain our policy of charging at least 10% lower than our neighbouring boroughs on almost everything, and that in itself is significant. We don't get involved in the stealth taxes like the green waste tax, saying, oh, well, we may or may not put up council tax, but we charge you £50 or £75 to collect your green waste. Things like that. There's an enormous amount in here. It really is a good news story, whether we're looking at the capital expenditure or the revenue expenditure, the new initiatives that are coming out in both areas. Just for the benefit of Cabinet, there's been no update on our offer to purchase Uxbridge Police Station. I have written in again, and hopefully by next Thursday we may have something to report on the capital expenditure and on our offer of revenue support to the police. I, like yourself, Councillor Bianco, will wait until next Thursday when we can cover this in some detail. It is an extremely good budget and a very solid position for this council to be in at this time. Are these recommendations agreed? Agreed. Thank you. The next item, agenda item 9, page 121, the schools budget for 2018-19. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. This tends not to be widely debated at the annual council tax fixing meeting, because although it forms part of the council's budget setting process, the funding for schools in the borough is part of the ring-fenced dedicated schools grant. So although potentially overspends in there can have a wider impact, it's not part of the council's general revenue budget setting. Just a couple of things to draw attention to which have a wider impact. The first is to note that the Department for Education have agreed with the request that we made that the continuing pressures around the 3 early years centres in the borough should be funded from the dedicated schools grant, and the rationale very clearly is when the dedicated schools grant was created, additional funding was part of it because it funded the historical commitments around those centres. And whilst the ongoing work the Council is doing to ensure they are self-funding continues, clearly it is appropriate that the dedicated schools grant should continue to meet the commitment that it has always met hitherto. The second thing that I would draw attention to, and I've given a commitment that we will communicate this widely, not just to head teachers, but also to governors, is the information that's contained around the headlines of what's going on with the funding for the borough. It's particularly noteworthy because there is a new education funding formula which is beginning to come into effect, and the discretion that our schools forum has to flex the amounts within the dedicated schools grant that go to different types of school is beginning to reduce. And clearly the most important elements of that are around things like the level of funding, which is guaranteed at a minimum 0.5% increase per pupil. So all schools where numbers are either static or rising would, as a consequence of that, see an increase in the funding that they receive, and an additional increase around the pupil premium rates, and then confirmation that for the the free school meals, the level of funding will remain consistent. I think schools often do claim to be hard done by, and it's absolutely right that we recognise there are challenges there. The rising cost of employing teachers and other staff is putting pressure on school budgets as well. But in stark contrast to the local authority, where we've seen a very, very substantial reduction in the availability of funding coming through central government, schools have enjoyed a very, very high degree of protection, and indeed the money that used to come to the local authority to provide central services to schools has largely been shifted into school budgets in order to provide them with the additional funding that they've enjoyed over the last few years. So I think we can see that this is broadly a positive picture for Hillingdon schools, with areas of pressure within it. With that, I'd move the recommendations set out on page 122, recommendations 1 to 6. Clearly, should there be wider debate about those at the council tax fixing, we will be able to deal with any issues that arise then.
Thank you, Councillor Simmons. The early years centres, for the benefit of the Labour members present, because this will be their issue next week, Schools Forum consider that these centres should be in a position to run on a break-even basis without the need for DSG funding, and therefore the proposals from the Schools Forum is that 331.5k should be cut from cease at the end of 17-18, cut from next year. The request for clarification from the Education and Skills Funding Agency has effectively said, well, that's not quite the case, they should pay, it's their responsibility. However, if you refer back to the budget that we've just looked at in the General Fund, we did put in the cover in case the Schools Forum decided that this wasn't something that they could support, then we would have the necessary to support it ourselves. So either way, we've got it covered. Are the recommendations agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. So if we return to Agenda A and on to Agenda Item 10, which is on page 111, Standards and Quality in Education in Hillingdon, 16-17. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. We receive an annual report giving a picture of educational progress in the borough. This is the version for the previous academic year. It gives us a very broad range of information, and I'll just draw out a couple of things that are important, particularly in the context where we've said part of putting our residents first is about raising standards in education. So we see, notably, that amongst early years and primary schools, settings in Hillingdon are continuing to make very good progress when it comes to improving their performance. Which is not to say that we can be complacent about that, but the vast majority of these settings are ones which have a very direct relationship with us as a local authority because they are maintained settings, so they receive their funding through us. And clearly they also look to the council for some leadership and some challenge around the standards that they provide. And things which have been highlighted, including an issue highlighted on a number of occasions by the Labour group around early years attainment, continue to show very, very good progress against both London and national averages. I think then moving on to our secondary school, we do see overall a picture where children who are coming to their GCSEs, by and large, get a good service from the schools in the borough. And although there are a number of schools which have got quite a significant challenge, if we look at the system as a whole, it's performing quite strongly. I think the area where we have a particular concern is, as referred to on page 113, Key Stage 5. The children who've done very well throughout their time in secondary school are now coming on to do A-level stage qualifications, where even those who've previously done very well don't seem to get a particularly good set of outcomes in Hillingdon schools compared to our neighbours. And there's definitely a trend where Hillingdon parents are voting with their feet, and those children are going to out-of-borough schools in order to access the high-quality education that they aspire to. Now, we have clearly been challenging our secondary schools around this. I think there is perhaps a degree of complacency that stems from the fact that schools have buoyant levels of applications, waiting lists in the case of many schools in the borough, which means as long as the school remains popular and the Ofsted grade remains sufficiently good, that's quite a comfortable place for those schools to be. But that clearly is not right for those of our younger residents who are within the category where they should be having the opportunity at their school to get access to a really good university, and they're not doing so because the education is not sufficiently rigorous enough. And of course their peers who are going on to do things like apprenticeships are getting a really good service at schools in the borough. So we can demonstrate that for those young people there is access to a good educational outcome, but there needs to be a lot more challenge around this. And of course most of those schools are academies, so that challenge is a bit more difficult to provide than would otherwise be the case. And then just finally I draw attention to the point about Ofsted inspection data. I think it's been a key criteria to ensure that as many children as possible in Hillingdon have access to a school that is rated at least good, ideally outstanding. And we do continue to see progress on the proportion of schools that are in the borough that are rated good or outstanding by Ofsted, and that's gone up to 87% from 80% the previous year. And I would draw attention to the work that many of our officers have done, led by Dan Kennedy, to provide the challenge that's helped to bring that situation about. So with those comments, I've moved the recommendations and answer any questions that are forthcoming.
Thank you. Is the recommendation agreed? Thank you very much. Agenda item 11, page 153, Hillingdon's response to the draft. We were just wondering whether it was draft London plan. Councillor Burrows.
Yes, thank you, Leader. When I first got the report, I did think it was a typo, so I thought it should say Hillingdon's response to the daft London plan, because that's exactly what it is. Within this plan, there are ludicrous suggestions being made. One around parking standards, what becomes and constitutes a 0.4 of a car. I'm still trying to find out of manufacturers if they're making them. Greenbelt is being attacked, really. He's contradicted himself within his own plan. If you look at page 163.59, where officers have said, whilst policy G2, London's Greenbelt states that the protection of Greenbelt is maintained, it also states the enhancement of the Greenbelt to provide appropriate multifunctional uses should be supported. So in one hand he's saying I'm going to protect it, the other hand is saying I'll do basically what I want if I have to. There's also the brownfield sites. I could go on and take you through actually all 56 pages if you wanted me to, Leader, point by point. But we have put together to protect our own residents, because we have to remember that our own local development plans, our own planning policies are all driven by support from the London plan itself. And our residents have benefited from the robust policies that we have within this borough that have been supported by this administration. And therefore, our response is over 40 pages long. It's very comprehensive. I'm very pleased with what officers have done with this, and officers should be congratulated actually having to sit down and go through such a daft document and put together such a robust rebuttal to it to protect our own residents. And the recommendations here are on the top of page 154, points 1 to 3, and I certainly agree that recommendation 3, that our officers should meet with representatives from GLA to discuss concerns raised and actually participate in the examination process to progress the council's case. I think that's really important, because it's very easy to send in our response which could land on someone's desk and be left on someone's desk. It's entirely different if we're sitting there and we're putting our case. So I fully support that 100%, as well as the other recommendations that are there. And we will continue, as we always have, as a Conservative administration, that's putting our residents first, protecting our residents, and getting the best we can from the Daft London plan. I so move recommendations.
Thank you, Leader. The report, our response, I think, does give a good, comprehensive analysis of why the new London plan, if it was to be approved, would be detrimental. What strikes me about it is the lack of outer London awareness. And I would remind everyone that, of course, what we had when Boris became mayor was the creation of the Outer London Commission. And the sole purpose of the Outer London Commission was to ensure that there was a recognition in London planning terms that Outer London functions by its very nature, both historically and in terms of its demographics and in terms of its transport structure. It functions in a different way to the inner city streets of Camden, Islington and Westminster and places like that. And therefore the existing London plan does reflect quite correctly the sort of characteristics that make up an outer London area rather than a one approach, which maybe this is what it's trying to return to. I'm particularly concerned by reference, lots of things that concern me, but particularly concerned by a recognition that we don't know, the Mayor no longer needs or wishes to have an outer London transport strategy. Does he honestly believe, make sure I got this right, does Sadiq Khan actually saying to the people of Hillingdon, you've got perfect transport links? Because if he is, then that just reinforces what I believe, he's never been here. And if he has been here, he's never tried to get north to south using public transport. Because that is the consequence of one of these decisions, that he is saying we don't need a transport strategy because it all seems to be hunky-dory. We all know it's quite the opposite. We all know that further investment in the transport infrastructure of Outer London, and Hillingdon in particular, is just as vital to achieve whatever is going to come in terms of employment opportunities and housing opportunities. But also, what I'm most concerned about, if we were even able to reach the kind of housing targets that he wishes us to achieve, and bearing in mind we've exceeded our housing targets year on year, would you like to identify where the schools are going to be built? Because we know that Councillor Curley and Hillingdon Labour Party have failed that task. When given the option in Hayes as to where to put the new primary school, their answer was a blank piece of paper. So our challenge should be to Sadiq and to Councillor Curley and his colleagues, name the sites which will deal with the extra schooling, the extra health facilities, the GP surgeries, that all these additional housing units are going to be required. And quite frankly, most of the Labour councillors ought to be answering this exam question, because the bulk of this housing development is going to be in their backyard.
Thank you, Councillor Mills. I have to say that having talked to other London leaders about this the other day, leaders of all political parties have major reservations about this. It's no different for a Labour council, whether they're inner or outer London. There are severe reservations. As you say, it's a demonstrable lack of understanding about outer London boroughs, their environment and their residents. There's no doubt about that. But in so many areas now, from this to what we've seen at Haringey with the interference of the National Labour Party and putting their housing programme on the slippery slope, this is leading to a recipe for disaster in housing. Labour have lost the plot nationally and at a London level. What this is going to achieve is the reverse of what everybody wants to achieve. Nothing will happen. If you try to promote chaos, most sensible people will back away from the chaos. And that is what we are going to see here. Labour do not have a solution at all for housing, and it's something that we do need to draw to the electorate's attention. If you're banking on Jeremy Corbyn, you back the wrong horse. If you're banking on Sadiq Khan, he's even further behind. There's no hope at all. Absolutely right, the Daft London plan. Are the recommendations agreed? Thank you. Dynamic purchasing vehicles aren't point 4 of an ordinary vehicle that we would have to have if we were going back to the previous item. They're entirely different. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. You made the point I would have made. 0.4 of a dynamic purchasing vehicle is going to be quite hard to fit on anybody's driveway, as well as the question of whether it will run along the road. But as you say, this is something completely different. This is about saving money and delivering a more efficient service around procurement of SEN provision and independent fostering agencies, something that we, along with all other authorities, spend a good deal of money on, identifying placements for children whose needs are not able to be met by the services that we have in-house because of their specialist nature. And the aim of this is to bring about saving, improve the efficiency and the quality of what's delivered. And for that reason, I commend the recommendations, 1 to 3 on page 212.
Are they agreed? Thank you. We now move to part 2.